Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Story Hour podcast, Voices Unscripted, Stories Rewritten, with your host, Sara Jaswal, a registered counselor, certified grief educator, and a certified life coach, and a lover of the human experience. I'm just so deeply passionate about life and just connecting with people on a soul level. And here I am today with another special guest who is also a fellow therapist and a coach. And I'm really excited to have her on. So we're just going to dive right into it. So today I have Corinna Killeen, who is a registered counselor and certified life coach based in North Vancouver, BC, who runs Corinna Killeen Counseling. She chose to become a counselor after navigating her own journey through significant losses, including her younger brother, after a lifelong battle with kidney disease, her father, and her stepfather. Karina offers online counseling services to adults throughout British Columbia. She describes herself as someone who has been through a lot of grief and loss and has come to find healing and joy in simple things. What drives her work is a belief in the power of authentic conversations and meeting people exactly where they are in their grief journey, creating what she calls a gentle place to land. She's also a devoted cat person and coffee drinker. So, welcome on, Karina.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Sarah.
Yeah, nice to see you. How are you doing? How are you feeling? What's the
I'm
vibe today?
I'm good. I'm excited to be here. I'm a little bit nervous, but yeah, I'm glad to be here with you and to talk about something that really matters to me, grief.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course. Yeah, I love that. And it's funny because it's like we have this unwanted grief club, if you will.
Yeah.
Always feel it to other grievers as well. It's like we don't want to be here, but we're here. And yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. We're
Cool,
here.
cool. Okay, let's start. Let's just get into it. So let's talk about your story a little bit. Of course, this is the Story Hour podcast, kind of
Yeah.
get to know you a little bit. So can you take us into your story a little bit? Who did you lose? We mentioned that, but how did you lose them? And then what those early days of grief really look like for you? If you can give us a little bit of context into that.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so for me, as you mentioned in the intro, my younger brother died of kidney disease. So that losing him was one of, the biggest things that's happened in my life. Of course, there have been others, but he was born very ill. He was ill his whole life. And oftentimes with folks who have illness like kidney disease, he had other illnesses as well. And then sometimes treatment, long-term treatment of certain things can cause other illnesses, unfortunately. Um, and so with my brother, he lived to be 24 years old. I was older. I'm 2 years older. I'm 26. I was 26 when he passed away. Um, and I mean, there was a lot there, right? Growing up with a sibling who was very ill, and a lot of things that worked for other people who have the same disease, kidney disease, um, might not be cure-alls, but they would be okay, right? The treatment would work, but a lot of things just never worked for him. And so he was extremely ill. He had a kidney transplant that failed after a couple of years. He was on kidney dialysis most of his life. And that ended up taking a toll on his health. It weakened his heart, and he actually passed away due to issues with his heart valves, not due to kidney disease. He had multiple heart surgeries before he passed away. And then he was going to have a third one, and we were basically told, well, we can do it again, but it's not going to last really more than a month. We can buy him more time. And he decided not to. He'd been through a lot. He was very frail. So we had a party for him. We had a luau. We invited people. We decided to celebrate his life and just be there for him in his last days. And I think in speaking, about that, I think we talked about what was it you said, like the experience and the grief around that. Um, Being there, witnessing somebody in their last, at the end of their life, no matter how young or how old they are, it's a lot, right? It was a lot to witness. It was a lot to be there for. I experienced a lot of anticipatory grief throughout his life. Um, I knew that he wouldn't live very long, and I thought that I had accepted that. I really thought that I understood that, and I think I did on, like, a cognitive level, I understood. But grief, right? Grief is more, it isn't just your brain, right? It's your body, it's your feelings, it's your memories. And that was difficult. Losing him, being there with him as he took his last breaths, took a couple weeks once he was no longer receiving life support to die. And it was traumatic. It's traumatic to witness somebody go through that. Um, and I think afterwards I thought, well, I've been there for him. I've seen his struggles. I've seen so much pain and suffering, so many medical treatments that although I know were all well intentioned, but that didn't work. And seeing just his daily pain could be a lot to just take in, his suffering. And he really wasn't living a quality of life. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that as they see their loved ones become ill. Um, and so I actually had a bit of a sense of relief after he passed for a little while because I was hyper vigilant. I was on high alert. I was scared. He had a lot of medical issues. Every time I heard an ambulance, I thought, is it going to my house or is it going to, where my brother is? Um, and so there was a bit of a sense of relief initially because I thought, okay, he's not suffering. And also it's just a lot to witness. And I thought, you know what? I grieved my brother while he was alive. I'm just going to move on. Everything's going to be fine. I just was like, I don't really want to deal with this. And this was before I became a therapist. And I just thought, no, I'm just going to like throw myself into every single other thing in my life and I will just move on. And I laugh now because it's like such a huge thing to go through. And
Totally.
just, yeah, right. And just, I was like, I don't really feel like experiencing grief. I've had enough grief. And so I ate a lot and I drank a lot and I worked really hard. And I just tried, to be honest, just not deal with it. And I did pretty well with that actually for a little while. I thought, you know what? I don't have the energy. I remember a manager handing me like a card at work and was like, we have counseling. And I thought, like, I'm okay. If I open that door, who knows what's gonna like fall out. So
Yeah,
I just kind of kept going for a while. And but then, as things do, we can't just not feel things and we can't just push them down and push them away and pretend everything's fine for very long. That works for a little while. Um, then I started feeling sick and having health issues and I right. And I remember
yeah.
talking to a counselor and she's like, "Well, what's going on in your life? Like, you're having these health issues." And I was like, "Oh, not very much. Yeah, I'm fine." And she's like, "Tell me about what's happened the last few years." And I was like, "Well, yeah, my brother passed away." And she's like, "Oh, well, that's like a pretty big thing." I was like, "Oh, it's fine. It's fine. It's not really." And she was like, "Okay." So she started teaching me, like, because I was so disconnected from
Mhm.
myself because I didn't want to deal with it, um, to like breathe and start feeling my feelings. And I was like, oh, a lot of the time, I think I was so disconnected and witnessing my brother's death, I think was also quite traumatic. It's not like, I think that came up before, it's not like the movies where it's peaceful and you're there with your loved ones, and it is beautiful to be there for someone when they pass, but it's also a lot to take in. It's a lot to try to process, right? So,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you for sharing that aspect of your grief and loss. I had chills when you were actually sharing that. There's so much that you shared in there, and yeah, it's a lot, right? And like you said, just that anticipatory grief, the anticipation, and then just feeling hyper vigilant. Like you mentioned, when the ambulance would come, like, is that coming to our house? Is my brother okay? That dialogue that we have, and that panic and fear, which is so natural that we would feel that way. So yeah, if you don't mind me asking, what was your brother's name?
His name was Nathaniel.
Nathaniel. Nice.
Yeah.
I always
Yeah.
like that. I always like to know because it helps to honor them. And, I believe in obviously like I talk about this a lot, but I do believe in the afterlife and I do believe that we go somewhere where that is, I'm not sure, but I do believe that our loved ones are still around somewhere, somehow. And so it's nice to put a name to the story and to what you're sharing. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you
Mhm.
for that. I believe that too. Yeah, I do believe that our loved ones are with us and, we carry them with us regardless, if you believe in an afterlife or what you believe. I do
Mhm.
believe pieces of them are always with us,
Yeah.
right? I know he's always with me.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know
Mhm.
after his death, it was it was hard to like I missed him a lot. I missed his personality. I missed just who he was, like a real prankster, a real joker. He was like very irritating at times. He had like a very silly sense of humor. And being his older sister, sometimes, I was like, he could be really irritating.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's sibling love there for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned also losing your dad and also your stepdad. Do you want to
Yeah.
briefly let us know what that was like for you and
Yeah.
how that might have been different than the loss of your brother? We'll get
Yeah.
more into detail as we go on,
Sure.
but if you could share what the story is with your dad and stepfather.
Sure. Yeah. So my dad died about 5 years later. So if you can like imagine too, I feel like, my not dealing with grief, but kind of dealing. And then I felt like, I'm kind of getting my footing. Things are okay. Because as grief does, like your life still moves along. And I've still had a lot of good things in my life too. Like I met my husband, things with work were going okay. I have friends that care about me. So I felt like I was kind of getting my footing in some senses, like things were good. And then my dad passed away. So I got a call that morning at work. He'd had a heart attack. A lot of men do have heart attacks, as unfortunate as that is, and a lot of the time they're okay, right? It may be surgery or medication, etc. And I really thought, okay, he'll probably be fine. When I got the call, I thought they'll probably do some kind of procedure, like I'll get there. I had walked to work that morning, and I don't know why, sometimes again it's that hypervigilance. You're like kind of scared. I thought I'll just like get home as quick as I can. I don't live that far away, but it was like the longest walk of my life. Um, and so I got home, I got there and I just kept thinking, he'll probably be okay. So they were doing all these tests and I was waiting. And again, I just kept thinking, he'll probably be okay. And they sent him to another hospital and they said, "Oh, that's where they do the tests." Interestingly, it was actually like they sent him to a different town, like in Metro Vancouver. It was actually where he was born. And I knew as soon as they told me, I was like, "Oh, he's gonna die there." Like I just knew. I was like, "He was born there, he's gonna die there." And I don't know how I knew. I just knew.
Right.
Um, and so we get there because they're like, yeah, we're not bringing him back from there. He's got to stay there. And so he went into cardiac arrest a few minutes after we got there, and he passed away shortly after. So it was extremely quick from like the call to losing him. And I think, you mentioned some of the differences, right, between losing someone like my brother where he was ill his whole life. It was gradual. We knew it was coming. And then, with my dad where it was like I had thought that he was quite healthy. I had no idea he had any heart problems. I don't think he did either. To all of a sudden, I think it was like a Monday morning and you go through a million different feelings and experiences from like going to work in the morning to rushing to the hospital to a death. But it was shocking and I felt just very like disoriented by it. I remember driving home that night afterward and even with GPS, knowing where I live, I got lost. I ended up on like a side street somewhere because I was just so disoriented by it. Um, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I think that whole conversation around, yeah, like the anticipatory versus sudden, and I know we'll get into that, but That's tough, right? It's really tough. And they're almost like vastly different experiences in a way, and maybe have some parallels as well. Thank you for sharing that. You also mentioned your stepfather as well. Do you want to just kind of let us know briefly about that loss as
Yeah.
well?
Yeah. So my stepdad, lovely, just lovely man, just the sweetest. Um, he also, right, really healthy. He often cared for my brother before my brother's death. He was really kind of like the glue holding my family together in many ways. He was doing great as far as I knew. I spoke to him. So it's, of course, with grief, things are always interesting, right? So my dad, he died in 2018 in June, near the end of June after Father's Day. So I'd seen him around Father's Day, and then he died around the end of the month. So my stepdad died 2 years later, also in June, before Father's Day. Yeah,
Interesting.
right? So it's weird. So again, things are like it's COVID starting. Things are like, okay, we're all getting ready to go over to visit my mom and stepdad for their 25-year wedding anniversary. And we thought, even though it's COVID, we'll just all camp outside their house, like it's summer, whatever, we're gonna do this. And I remember my husband kind of being like, there's a lot going on, maybe you shouldn't go. And I just like had this feeling like, no, I really have to go, even if I'm like out in a tent outside their house. Like I just really have to see them.
Right.
And so the last time I talked to my stepdad was on my birthday, which is a few days before the date of his death. And then, yeah, a few days later, I got a call from my brother saying, similar story. He also died of a heart attack. He called the ambulance, wasn't feeling well, and he had passed away. Yeah,
So another
yeah,
sudden death.
another
Yeah.
sudden death. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
that's
during a
tough.
bizarre time in the world, like
Yeah.
COVID. Yeah,
For sure. Yeah. Wow, so much. And that's such profound loss, three different family members. Sounds like you're close. It sounds like maybe with all of them. And yeah, the impact I can only imagine, what that would have. And grief, I know you know this, of course, because you do this work as well, but it's that compounded grief,
yeah,
right? It's so complex. And I speak to this so often, is that people, I don't think, really understand how complex grief and loss is. And then especially when it comes to compounded grief. It just piles on top of one another. And like you said, right, with your brother, you kind of just pushed it aside because you just didn't have the energy or the capacity to like go there until you realize it started causing you health issues, which is a big thing that happens in grief and loss. And again, that's going back to just like not expressing ourselves and not dealing with our emotions and our feelings. And it just gets shoved and shoved. And so then having that and then having your dad pass, which is going to compound on the loss of your
yes,
brother, and then your stepfather is going to compound then on the top of, the other two losses. And we may be able to do the work in between those losses, but they're still compounded. Like it's still so complex, and there's a lot of interconnection that happens. And so you can imagine, for anyone who's listening, like the gravity of the grief and loss. And like, I think Corinna, you mentioned, is like it's not just in the brain, it's everywhere in your body, in your mind, in your brain, in your cells. Like it literally is physiologically and psychologically, it completely shakes you to your
yes,
core, really, is what it does. I know it's sometimes hard to talk about that and relive that, but I also do believe that it's nice to honor our loved ones, and speaking about them and sharing their story is really important, because I do believe that we should carry their memory alive. And, so I appreciate that. Um, Let's talk. There's a few things that you had mentioned, but let's talk about the medical trauma. You had mentioned that briefly, I think now, but also when we had our phone call, chatted about that. And for people who don't understand, like having someone with an illness or being a caregiver or just having such a prolonged life illness, can
mhm,
you share more about that so listeners can understand the impact it has?
yeah.
And then how did like the medical system or the medical trauma shape your experience? Either the way you showed up for your brother, for your family, even for yourself, or even just the way you remember that time. Like, what about that time was traumatic, or what about them dealing with that in that way?
I think I think a really big thing is like witnessing the suffering of another person is, I think, something we don't talk about as much, right? It's
Mm,
often, I think our society is becoming more grief and trauma informed. It's taking time, but often we don't talk about, vicarious trauma, witnessing other people's trauma, hearing about it. And it's not something I recognized at the time, of course, but after, in retrospect, just realizing, my brother, he was in physical pain all the time, right? And that affected his personality. It affected how he interacted with people. It affected his outlook on life. And just witnessing that amount of suffering and it's not to critique the medical system. I really
mm,
believe that people who work in healthcare of any kind, I do believe they're there for the right reasons and they do want to help people. And I believe they really were trying to help him the best that they could. Um, but I would just say things that are, you know, routine for a person who's struggling with a chronic illness or with terminal illness, these things become routine. And when you think about that, he had a big shunt in his arm where they put together a bunch of I'm not going to probably say this correctly. If someone's watching, who's dealt with this, they might know more than me, but they actually put a bunch of like his veins together in his arm. They created a shunt so that he could do dialysis. And then they would take it was almost like a prong needle and put it in to be able to take all the blood out of his body and essentially wash it through dialysis and put it back in because his kidneys didn't work correctly, right? So he had this huge, like, throbbing vein on his arm that could get easily infected all the time. It was painful. It was necessary, right? But that's just like a small portion of what he lived with on a daily basis. And like you can just imagine how that would affect your self-esteem, your concerns about cleanliness, right? Like people asking questions. Um, so I would say there's just a lot of things that people generally just don't understand, right? Because he was ill his whole life, his growth was like he didn't grow to be maybe the average size of like the average male. So he was very short. So people could be very insensitive, even though, I find things are getting better. People are a little more self-aware, but I think there's a lot of different facets to medical trauma. There's witnessing someone you love and also acknowledging, for the average person, maybe going for like a blood test is really stressful, right? For a lot of people, that induces a lot of worry and fear, or a surgery. And that's fair. It is concerning and scary, but you consider a person struggling with chronic illness or terminal illness that might be there every day. They might be getting needles every day. They might be going for surgeries constantly. They might be going to the doctor. Like it's not a once a year, twice a year thing for them. They're going all the time, right? And I think like in any industry, sometimes people can become desensitized to that, right? But this huge amount of pain. And so I think for me, I definitely do have a bit of a different view of the medical system after witnessing the amount of pain, seeing my brother in. And I think sometimes too, some in the medical industry, people can become a little desensitized when they're
mm.
having to support people that are in so much pain and going through so much. And so I think my view on medical trauma is it can affect people in many different facets, but it was painful to witness
Of
for
course.
me emotionally. So, I mean, I can, a thousandfold for the people actually going through it and how it affects them and their self-esteem too. It can, right? When you're in pain, you've had a lot of surgeries, there's a lot of your body might look different than what you thought it would, right? There's so many different facets. Yeah.
Wow, you shared on so many things that are coming through right now. And one of them, the first thing I'll speak to that feels really alive for me is what you just shared about. Like, we talk a lot about secondary losses, right? In grief. And you just prime example of that, right? So the primary loss is say like like the kidney disease, right? But then the safety, the confidence, the self-esteem, the loss of your ability to function as quote unquote, for lack of a better word, like normal person in society, like so much, right? And that is just compound again, going back to the compoundness of all that, like, and for the person obviously who's going through it, but then like you said, also for yourself as well. And you mentioned vicarious trauma. For people who are listening who might not know what that is, do you want to just share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, vicarious trauma in like a short definition is being traumatized by almost, I guess the word would be like secondhand information, like witnessing of trauma. You're not necessarily going through it yourself, but it starts to affect you in a similar way to how experiencing it firsthand would. So, like after my brother passed away, witnessing what happened, I started to become like very dissociative. I felt very detached from reality because it was hard for me to process. It was hard for me to witness what had actually happened. I was actually so overwhelmed by my own emotions and the things that were going on that I was really feeling detached and a need to detach, right? So I guess that would be kind of a simple example, but I think a lot of people who witness their family members pass away, who have family members who struggle with chronic illness, um, they are often traumatized. I think sometimes they don't even realize that they'll probably find they have a lot of chronic fatigue and exhaustion and dissociation, and like they're probably really burnt out often afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I didn't know what that was until recently too, that vicarious traumas, until we were in counseling, until I
Yeah.
learned about the trauma and the grief, and it actually made so much sense. And, just with everything you shared about the medical system, and again, it's not to put the medical system down or anything, it's just the way it is. And, like you mentioned, I worked in a hospital setting before being a counselor. That was my job. And I for sure saw it every single day, the desensitization. It's everywhere. Like it's pretty bad, to be very transparent and honest. And I think, like you said, it's in every industry, right? Like people get burnt out, like life happens. And, we all have our own stuff going on, but we still have to show up. We still have to go to work. We still have to pay bills, like, all of that. And so, like, I get both sides of it as well, right? And then it's unfortunate because then the person who's sick then gets like the brunt of that, or whatever that may look like. And so it's really sad to see that, and I can imagine, especially as a caregiver, watching that, and then feeling the grief and loss that your brother's feeling, but then also feeling your own grief and loss and everything that you're witnessing, like you said, the dissociation, the like pulling back, the just hypervigilance, like it impacts so many different aspects of our life. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Hmm.
Thank you for sharing that and your personal experience.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's real. It is what it is, right? And I guess that's a part of life in a way. And things are getting better, like in certain aspects. But again, like you said, being grief and trauma informed, we've come a long ways. Like where we are today
Yeah.
in 2025, we've come a long ways, but we're still not where we need to be. But that's how change happens, right? I think just we just evolve and grow as society individually and then obviously collectively. And so I hope we're heading in a really good direction and people become more educated and more aware. I want to talk about family unit. I know we talked about this too, Karina, and I talk about this often too with work that I do with CNIB, and then what I've experienced personally with my own chronic health condition with my vision loss, is that it doesn't just impact the person who's going through the illness or the condition or what have you. It impacts the entire family unit. And I think in families and in general, everyone grieves very differently, right? Like
Yeah.
no two people are going to be the same. And that can either bring people closer together or it sometimes also creates distance.
Yeah.
I've seen it firsthand happen, and it's not right or wrong. It just is because we all just function differently. We all show up differently. And so, what did that look like for you and your family? And then, how did your brother's illness and passing shift the dynamics within your family unit? I think a lot of times what we talk about also is like roles changing, right? So like you
Mm.
were a sibling. Like you said, you joked around with your brother. He was funny. There was humor and you guys had that sibling love. But then he was sick and then you also were playing caregiver and support. And I think there's grief and loss in that as well when we lose that like role of, in your case, like a sibling. So do you want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. I was actually talking to my sister about this a while ago. Um, and in this case, we actually both agreed, even though our experiences are a little different, we were both kind of saying that because he had always been so ill, our whole family dynamic was built around that in a sense. And I think a lot of people who have someone who's terminally or chronically ill in their family from like long time or ongoing, or even when it maybe they're diagnosed and it moves on from there, because that in itself starts to shift the family dynamic. I think my mom for many years was my brother's main caregiver, and then she became ill, and so all of us, I think, took on different pieces, including my stepdad. And interestingly, because my brother was so ill, I would say towards the end, of course, he was who he was. He was a wonderful person. And at the same time, he required a lot of care, a lot of help, right? Getting to appointments and getting his medication and things like that. And so I think our roles started to shift a long time before his death. Right
Right.
when many years before, when his kidney transplant had failed and he had started to become really ill, I think we all had to kind of help and take care or take care of ourselves, perhaps more. But our whole, when I look at it and I think back, even trips, it was hard to take trips because he was very ill and he couldn't be far from a dialysis unit. Just the way our whole family was kind of set up was around that. So by the time he passed away, I think, I kind of talked about a bit of that relief. And I think a little bit of that relief, although I know that can be hard for people to hear sometimes, right? But it's real sometimes when
Yeah.
you're witnessing that level of suffering and stress. Um, I and I know, like, a lot of people will talk about that, there's a bit of relief. And I think what it did for each of us was I noticed all of us have a little bit of, like, hyper independence. None of us really wanted to dig very deep and deal with it, even though there was a lot there. Um, and I would say that, me and my other siblings, I would say we're probably closer because of it. When you lose a sibling and you witness that, I would say it brought us closer together. Um, yeah, but I think for me, and kind of reflecting, I would actually say the dynamic changed a lot more around probably my stepdad's death than my brother's. Although it sounds kind of weird, I think we were all kind of already set up and in the roles we were playing before my brother passed away, just out of necessity.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. And again, like it's going to be different for every person, every family unit. But I think it's important to have this conversation. And also, I really like to honor if you do have a loved one that is sick and you're going through, this medical trauma and just all the medical care that your loved one needs, that you too are also going through a lot. And I think it's important to acknowledge that because a lot of times, um, we can put ourselves second, right? Because we're like, well, we're not the ones that are sick. We're not the ones actually having the illness. And then we dismiss that in a way. But it's equally important because your life has also changed. You're also
Yes.
grieving in a different way. Your loved one who once was one way is now it's different. And I learned that within my own personal experience. A lot had happened and I didn't realize that my entire family, my mom, my dad, and my siblings were also grieving because I was very much in my grief and I was like a lot of anger at the beginning. I was just very short and anytime that someone asked me, I was like on edge, I was hyper vigilant, like, all that comes with grief, like you mentioned too. And we had a lot of, to be very transparent, a lot of arguments, a lot of fights. And it wasn't until my sister and I had a really big blowout and I won't get into the details of it, but she basically had responded like, I didn't know you felt like that. And that woke me up. I remember feeling so much guilt and I felt so bad because basically they were walking around eggshells around me because I was so, like hot and cold. And anytime it'd come up, I would just snap. And so that was my own process. That was my own grief showing up in that way. And when she said that I realized that we can't read each other's minds. Right. And then I realized like they're also, and she shared, more of that and that they're also grieving. And I knew that I saw that with my mom and stuff and all these things. And that really woke me up. And I really understood like, wow, you guys are also going through a really hard time. It's not just me. And as a family, we were really going through it. We were individually going through it. And then as a family unit, we were really going through it. And each of us shows up very differently. Right, whether you express your emotions or feelings or you shut down or you go dismissive or what have you. And so that's why I think this conversation is really important. That, and if you are someone who, has a loved one, that it's okay to grieve. It's okay to honor yourself. It's okay to even sometimes take a step back if you need to and just breathe if you are able to do that.
That's
So,
so beautifully
yeah.
said. Thank you for sharing. Yeah. And
Hmm.
I think what you drew attention to too, which is so important, is the person, right? The person with the illness and their grief as well, right? They're grieving, right? The same as your experience, you're grieved for your loss and your experience. And my brother, I think a lot of the time was grieving too, right? He knew deep inside what was likely going to happen. And there were a lot of feelings there and a lot of pain. And it can be hard also to be, we're grateful that our families have good health and good things, excuse me, but can also be hard when you're the one struggling with health and other people are doing well and moving, or it feels like, or it looks like they're moving on and maybe doing things in their life that you would like to do or like to have. And those feelings sometimes I know he felt of kind of being left behind because he couldn't do those things and he was aware of, the fact that his lifespan wasn't going to be the same as other people's, right? And witnessing
Absolutely.
that and him trying to process that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It takes you to some dark places. I have to be very honest and transparent. Like obviously I share a lot about that, but even, it's so profound and it impacts every aspect of our life. Something I think is really important to touch on that you mentioned is because I know a lot of people it's controversial, but people have a hard time with like the relief aspect of it, like you mentioned, I think a few times, and I
Yeah.
agree with you that that is very normal, and a lot of people do feel like they can finally breathe again, if you will, once their loved one is not suffering and they're not in pain and they've passed on. So for anyone who's listening that might, wonder like how do you feel relief? And I think it can come across as there's no compassion there. Like
Yeah.
how can you feel relief when your loved one just passed away? Do you have anything
Mm,
you want to share or add to that from your experience or just in general?
mm.
Why someone might feel relief and why it's okay to feel the relief.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think when it comes to the relief piece, when you also think, right, it's you're living in this high stress often environment. And again, we go back to like, you know, in the movies, things look calm and this and that. But in reality, when you look at what a lot of people are facing and a lot of people are caregiving or they're in charge of the care for the person or they're involved in some way. And that takes a lot, like mentally, physically, emotionally. Um, and it is work too, no matter how much you love someone, caring for another person when they're ill is work. It is work, right? And again, it's mental, it's emotional, it's physical. Maybe for some people it feels spiritual. Um, you know, People need medication, they need treatment. They like sometimes that brings unfortunately a financial burden for some people, even though we have a decent medical system in Canada. there's a lot of aspects to caring for someone who's ill. Some of it's emotional. Again, we go back to like how difficult it is to witness someone when they're struggling and the toll that takes on you. And often there's also a lack of support in society. How often, like, have you probably been told, I know a lot of people listening are like, oh, you're so strong. Oh, you're doing great. Okay, see you. And I know people don't mean to be insensitive or anything like that. And a lot of people would help if they could, etc. But that's a lot to carry. And some people are, I've talked to people who sometimes they actually go on leave or quit their jobs to take care of people
Yeah.
who are near their physical end, right?
Hmm.
Or they're doing that plus taking care of somebody. Often, if they have the financial means, then it's like the emotional. They're overseeing, and even overseeing somebody's care is a lot. So yeah, I think, sorry, now I'm like, what was the question again? I feel like I kind of
We're
went off
talking
on
about relief. Yeah, we were
the
talking about relief, but I
relief.
love
Yes. Yeah,
very
sorry.
important what you
Yeah,
yeah, no
yeah. And
worries.
so there
Yeah.
is, right, all of a sudden you're carrying something heavy, no matter if it's with a lot of love, and all of a sudden you're putting it down, you're surrendering it. Maybe there's a bit of acceptance in that, okay, like what I know with my brother, I was there when he passed away, and it was like, okay, I'm not going to get, a call of something happening. That was a bit of a relief, right? There's not going to be any emergency, right? I know that he is not in pain, and that was a really big relief for me. I thought witnessing his suffering and the sadness and, like everything he went through, I just thought I'm not going to have to witness that anymore because that's a lot. It really weighs on you emotionally and mentally. So, yeah, I think it's hard because people don't like to hear that, but it doesn't mean that you're not grieving. It doesn't mean that you're not sad. It just meant for me in that moment, like a weight felt like it was lifted. Um, but at the same time, I still carried my grief and my sadness and the trauma of what had happened.
Of
Yeah.
course, I love all of that, what you shared. And even when you talk about gratitude and stuff, it's not grateful for them passing, but it's like grateful that they're not suffering. I've heard of many people share that. Like, I'm not grateful that, my person died, but I am glad and I am relieved that they're not in pain, that they're not suffering, that they're not in agony, because watching that and having them experience that, like, is really hard. And so I agree with you with everything you shared. And I think that is just a normal human reaction to feel that relief. And a lot of times, obviously, in death, dying, grief, and loss, is like we want to hold on to our person. Obviously, we don't want to
Yeah,
lose anyone.
of
But the
course.
reality is, at some point, we all are going to die. And some people leave a lot sooner than we'd like. But that relief part of it, it's just that they're okay. And like you shared too, it was peaceful, right? And I mean, it could be a lot worse, or like you said, if it was an emergency or if they were in a lot of pain as they left, that would be a whole other traumatic experience in itself if you were to witness that. And a lot of people do witness that. They do witness their loved one passing and dying in a very traumatic way. And so, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Let's talk about anticipatory grief versus sudden grief. You mentioned that with your brother. Of course, we talked about anticipatory grief and then sudden grief, right? When we don't know someone's going to die and it kind of happens really fast. How does anticipatory grief feel different from grief that hits all at once? And then what maybe some similarities, if any?
I think with anticipatory grief, I mean, you're doing a lot of processing, and I think you're often trying to, I know for me, it's like kind of trying, I felt like I was trying to get my bearings. I kind of thought, like, once my brother passes away, not that I'm like waiting or about that, but I'm thinking, like, what does life look like? What might that mean for me? Right? Like, I felt like it was for me trying to like acknowledge what was going on and maybe have a level of acceptance around it. And then trying to go like, so where do I fit in that? What does life for me look like? Like, how do I cope with this? Right? Whether consciously or unconsciously.
Right.
Where I would say with sudden, like with my dad and my stepdad, the way they passed away really suddenly, like I would almost like when I think about that, I think about like taking a really deep, sharp breath because you're like startled. It's just like it's sudden, it's not expected, and it challenges your beliefs about the world. Um, when my dad died really suddenly, I had all these beliefs about the world, about like my own genetics, about my family. A lot of my relatives live to be very elderly. I probably will too. My dad probably will. And that was just an assumption I lived with in the world. I thought he's pretty healthy. He'll live to be really, really elderly. He'll be there. And even though, like, my dad, my parents were divorced when I was young, he always lived a ways away. But I had this sense of safety knowing my dad's out there, even if he doesn't live close. If I really need him, I can call him. Like, it was like one of those anchors I felt in the world. Whereas all of a sudden, when he died really suddenly, that shook my whole belief system. I thought, okay, well, now maybe I won't live very long. For some reason, I had this assumption I would live a long time. My dad would live a long time. People I love would live a long time. That's all of a sudden shattered. And now I don't know what's going to happen, you know? And then my beliefs about my relationship with my dad. I kind of thought he'd be around a long time. I would spend more Christmases with him and birthdays with him, and he would be there if I needed him. That, like, one of those anchors that I have in the world. All of a sudden, that's just gone. That's gone in one day, less than 24 hours. A bunch of my assumptions about my own world, my future, and my life are just gone without a lot of processing time. And, with my stepdad as well, I felt a little better equipped to deal with his death because when my dad died, because it shook me so deeply, it shook my belief system. I had really severe anxiety after he died. Like I mentioned, I had walked to work that day. I was like trying to, be healthier and whatever. And for like 6 months, even though I live close to work, I drove to work. I was like, there's no way I'm gonna be without my car. What if something else happens? I have to get there immediately. And I was terrified. I thought, like, I have no control over anything that happens. And that terrified me. Like, I felt powerless. I felt anxious. I felt scared. And so I think, like, one of the big differences for me again was like anticipatory grief. There was, although it was painful and traumatic, I felt like I had time to process some of it on a certain level. Like
Right.
you still need to do a lot of processing after some of your assumptions in anticipatory grief. It can be completely different. Um, but when my dad died, because I had pushed aside a lot of my grief when my brother died, I thought, I'm fine. I've dealt with a lot of stuff. I can handle it. But when my dad died, it was like that closet that I kept shoving all those things in and just closing the door and not dealing with anything. It was like that closet door got opened and every single thing that was in it fell out and it was on the floor and there was no putting it back in the closet. It was like, you cannot shove all this back in there. This is out, it's on the floor, and you have to deal with it now. You don't have a choice. This is it. This is the time. And so that for me, I think was the time where I was like, okay, I got all this stuff on the floor. I got to pick it up. I got to look at it. I got to deal with it. I have to deal with this wildly terrible anxiety that I'm experiencing now because everything feels out of control. And I wasn't a counselor at that time. And I remember like having to call my boss and be like, I have terrible anxiety. I can't come to work today. And he was really sweet. He's like, okay, well, I hope you feel better tomorrow. Like he was so nice. Like it's supportive, which a lot of people don't have that, but like I had to get counseling and I had to go to support groups and I had to read about it. I had to talk about it. And I started like reading books about near death experiences and like it just both experiences profoundly changed me as a person, but in really different ways. And I think you talked about that compounded grief. And I think a lot of the time people go in their own way. They're like, I'm okay. Things are okay. I can handle it. I'm not going to get support. I don't want to deal with it. But then you have another thing because life things compound. There's always something coming. And then it's like there's going to be more and more and more things throughout your life. And eventually you have to deal with it in some form. You have to acknowledge that you need support, that you need help. And so, yeah, that anxiety was quite severe. That's when I really started like going to counseling and getting support. Um,
Right.
and, I noticed that with a lot of clients that I support too, right? There's a lot of anxiety often in really big, especially sudden losses, because
Mhm.
you have those assumptions, right?
Yeah.
We have these neural maps in our minds that it actually maps our relationships with people and our future assumptions. And that changes when someone dies suddenly. All of a sudden, people talk about grief brain and it's a real thing. And your mind is literally forming new neural connections based on this was my assumption, and now those assumptions have changed, and my reality is now different,
Yeah.
right? So it's a huge thing. Um, and I think it's also a big part of it is anchoring to like what you know is true, like what you know to be true in your life, and what are those things that do anchor you. And it does take a bit of work, right? It's what are your beliefs about life, about who you are, about the person that you lost, right? And what do you want? Because sometimes that shakes us to the core and we're going like, who am I? What am I doing? Why am I here? But a lot of people don't experiencing a lot of anxiety before grief. That might be a new thing for somebody, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, so much there. I loved everything you shared. And I think, you know, what's coming through right now too is like our basic need, every human basic need is safety. And so what you're sharing about what your assumptions were of, well, they're gonna live, I don't have to worry about that kind of thing, which I think a lot of us would do that. I'm guilty of that too. And it's that safety. And then when that's ripped right under you, it yeah, that's what happens. And that's what Karina's, even touching on is like that sudden grief and then the anxiety around that. But yeah, it's like the rug's been pulled under you and everything you
Yes.
thought you knew about the world, about yourself, about your family, about your relationships, about everything has literally collapsed right in front of you. And now you're there and you're looking at all those pieces and now you're like, now what? And like, what is my purpose? What am I doing? What does this look like? You almost start to like question everything because again, that safety is such a basic need, a human need. When that falls apart, it feels like nothing is safe or you're not safe anywhere and having to rebuild that. And something else you touched on, Karina, too, was we have to go there. We have to go to those places. It's hard. Like, we're not denying that. And I share this often too. It's probably one of the hardest things to do. However, we need to go through it to get out of it. And so that's just, the more we keep stuffing it and stuffing it, it's gonna catapult and it's gonna explode and it's gonna be very harmful. And that can show up in so many different ways. We talked about it impacting our health. It's very true, especially everything's connected, mental health, emotional health, physical health. And so if one is off, the other is going to be impacted. And it's just going to really cause a lot of havoc in your life, in your body, in your mind. So it's really important to, work through that and taking it step by step because there's a lot there. But really acknowledging that. And I think the support is so needed because we're not meant to do this alone. None of us are. No matter what you do, who you are, where you come from, we all need help. Doesn't matter what profession you're in. We're therapists. We also see therapists. And I think there's such a misconception around that. It's like, well, why do you need help? You probably know it all. I'm like, well, no, because when you're in it, you don't even see anything else, right? Like, we all need support. We're all human. Um, and so I think a lot of times, just wrapping up with the anticipatory grief and sudden grief, Karina, is a lot of time, myself included. I think this conversation, or you kind of have that philosophical thought of people think is one easier than the other. is it better to know and have this prolonged anticipatory grief, or would you rather die suddenly or have a loved one die suddenly? And I'm curious, did knowing the loss was coming with your brother make anything easier, or did it just make it harder in a different way? And then also, do you think having time to prepare actually helps, or is that just a misconception?
Mm. Yeah, I know there are these philosophical, like these big questions often in grief, and I think
Mhm.
part of that too comes from people being in so much pain and not feeling validated or not feeling supported. I notice that where it's, when we're like, I see, I look up grief stuff all the time and feel this is loss is the worst and this is the most disenfranchised and this, and I think I can't remember, I think it's a quote, but I can't remember who it's by, but it's like, what's the worst kind of grief? Yours is the worst.
Yeah, I love
And
that.
what I would say is, say with my brother, what I kind of picture is, when we see babies when they're little, right? Little babies, and they cry. They cry because they're hungry. They cry because they're sad, right? They cry just because they need care. They know they're uncomfortable, but they're new. So, like,
Mhm.
a baby's pain threshold and your pain threshold are going to be pretty different. And so when it comes to loss, I think we do this thing of like, well, this is worse and this is worse, but it's like, okay, but my sister-in-law says this, like, your hardest thing is your hardest thing. And it's true. It's like, okay, well, if you've never had a loss before, the loss that you have is going to be the worst loss, right? So, like with my brother, that was the worst loss at that time.
Of course.
And right. And then as time moved on, like losing my dad the way I did, that was the worst I was like at the time.
Mhm.
Each one affects you so differently, and the relationship between, you know, I I also support people with pet grief too. So like sometimes people are losing pets and it's their first big loss, and that's
Mhm.
their hardest thing, right? Losing your parent, the first parent, it's the hardest thing. And
Right.
so I think for me, I wouldn't say that the one is harder. I would just say that they're different because one, where you are in your life at the time and the support that's available to you, your own health, your own mental health. Um, like there's just a lot of factors that have to do with each loss. Like with the loss of my stepdad, I felt I had more internal resources. I felt like I had done some work, so I wasn't as scared. The anxiety wasn't as high. I knew, okay, this is horrible, but I can get through this. I know what to do. I know. Right. So I think
Right.
it's a mix of factors, but also the relationships you have with people. Like the relationship with my brother and my dad and my stepdad were completely different, and so were the roles that they played in my life. So those secondary losses that I experienced were different for each person. Like there's a few similar ones, right? Like my dad and my brother were not at my wedding. I don't have children, but they won't ever see, my other siblings' children. Like there's a lot of those like just societal markers that you want your people to be there for, and they're not there. But I've also lost pets. I had to put my 17-year-old cat down last year, and like that broke my heart. It was terrible. But my relationship with my cat of 17 years was completely different than my relationship with, say, like my brother or my stepdad. But it was still extremely painful.
Mhm.
So I think yeah, I think like the hierarchy of loss is not really something I believe in. I think it's
Right.
your hardest thing is your hardest thing.
Mhm. I
Yeah.
love that so much. Oh my gosh, so much goodness in what you're sharing. I just love that. So I love having these conversations. Like I always say this, I always learn so much when I'm, talking to someone else, whether it's on the podcast or not, and the work that I do with my clients, I always go home with my own takeaway. Like, wow, I learned something today. And so that's why I think these conversations are so important. And yeah, that hierarchy, I agree too. I think people, I don't know why we're programmed like that because it's very normal to compare. And, I experienced that too. Maybe shared this, maybe not, but I got a lot of that it could be worse. At least you have food on your table. At least you have a car. At least you have, at the time, like before I lost my license and all that, at least you have a roof over your head. And it could be worse. And I remember hating it. My body rejected that every time someone said that to me.
Yeah.
And I didn't really have a voice back then. I didn't really have that much of an understanding, but my body obviously knew. And I remember just thinking, like, this is my worst. Like, I've never lost my vision before. I've never lost my driver's license before. This is, to me, the absolute most traumatic, life-changing experience I've ever experienced in my 28,
Um,
30 years at the time.
wow.
And
Yeah.
so I heard that a lot, and I don't think it's intentional.
No.
Um, like, you said it before, like, I don't think people do that intentionally, but I think what it is people can't sit in the discomfort. They can't sit in, your discomfort, and then they're uncomfortable. So they try to say something to fix your grief. But we know in grief's not meant to be fixed. It's meant to be held. It's meant to be seen. It's meant to be understood. It's meant to be accepted. So a lot of times, and I've shared this a lot before too, is like sometimes saying nothing to someone who is grieving is actually better than saying this toxic positivity, and trying to fix it or change it and telling them that they should be grateful for XYZ when in that moment, this is the worst thing that's happened to them.
Yeah.
And we hear it often, right? Like, well, that's not as bad. Or we start comparing. I think that comparison really robs us of our own grieving journey.
Yes.
And yeah, it's just the way the world is. But I'm hoping that changes by everyone who's doing grief work. I know a lot of grief coaches and therapists talk about that. And I hope we can change the conversation around that. And I don't know if you have any final thoughts around that topic, but that was what was coming through to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was beautifully said. And I love what you shared too, right? You've been through something really big. And I think, sometimes people do that and we know it like it's coming from discomfort and some of it is coming from, right? That's what they're pulling on. Someone said it to them or, right? We kind of do that like emotional bypassing because we are uncomfortable. We want people to be okay. We don't want to see them in pain. But
Right.
it's a lot as a griever, someone going through something, and I think over time, hopefully that's something we start to shift away from, is just being compassionate for people and realizing, right, that we all need it's just nice sometimes for someone to validate what your experience is. They don't have to understand it, but
Right.
often it's, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that's
Mhm.
happening. That really sucks. Like, there doesn't
Yeah.
have to be a silver lining to everything. Things can
Mhm.
just really be sucky, and
Yeah.
it's
And
okay to
that's just it
acknowledge it.
is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And something too that just came through is for anyone who's listening is like, yeah, even a breakup. There's grief
Yeah.
and loss in a breakup. We're obviously talking about illness and that, but there's so many different losses. There's a breakup, there's a divorce, there's like Karina mentioned pet loss. Like all of that is valid. So if you've
Yes.
never lost someone physically, but you've gone through a really big breakup or you are, now divorced from your partner, if that's your worst and that's your hardest, then
Yeah.
that's your worst and hardest.
Yeah.
And I think we need to become more accepting of that for ourselves and then also for others and not just dismiss it because, well, it's not as big or as profound as another loss. So I really hope if you're listening, you take that from this. It's like whatever you're going through, that is your hard. That is the worst thing in that moment. And like Karina shared, it depends on where you are in life. What
Yeah.
resources do you have? What are your coping mechanisms? How much capacity do you have? Where are you in your window of tolerance? Are you in fight or flight? Or are you able to cope and breathe a little bit and just, are you grounded? Like there's so many things that come into play and factor of why we might be just so on edge or heightened with what's happening. And it's not right or wrong. My loss isn't greater than Karina's loss or vice versa. It's just that's not how it works. There's literally zero hierarchy in that.
I agree. And what I really like about what you're saying too is I think when we do the hierarchy, We also can stop other people from seeking support without meaning to. As a
Right.
counselor, sometimes I'll have people say things like, oh, this happened, but I'm doing, yes, it's beautiful to practice duality and be able to be with our own pain and know that we still have good things in our life. But sometimes when things are minimized over and over again, and people, oh, it's just this, oh, it's just that. It's like then people often don't get support who need it, right? If you're going through a breakup, you might really need support, or a divorce, or maybe you lost your job, or maybe your cat died, or maybe a lot of these losses, right? They can be like disenfranchised or kind of othered, whereas it's still important to seek support, right? If you're feeling overwhelmed, if you don't feel like you're able to cope, etc., or do you just need to talk to somebody about it? So I think the problem really is when we minimize different losses, then people
Mhm.
don't seek support, and then we have things compound, right? Maybe, you could have a bunch of small things happen and you're not seeking support, and then something really big happens, and then you're kind of in crisis, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's also like just great that you brought that up because we often have these little things that we minimize and society minimizes, but they are important and it's okay to seek support.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just touched on something too, is like we're life human. It's not just loss in a profound way. We're going through day-to-day things. We're going through just
Yes.
life. And then also you can have job loss, even loss of finances. That can all be
Yeah.
happening at the same time. And you
Yes.
can lose someone a week later. Your loved one can pass away. So you can imagine again the compounded grief and loss and the compounded trauma and all of that that's happening, that's bubbling up. So really important to recognize, even if you're in conversation with someone or you're sharing something about yourself, we can also do that to ourselves. We for sure do it to others, and that it just happens. But we also do that to ourselves. We minimize our own grief. We minimize our own feelings and emotions, and a lot of times we gaslight ourselves. I know I'm guilty of that.
Yeah.
There are times, even now, sometimes where I catch myself doing that. And then I'm like, hold on, this is valid right now. Like, with what's happening in my life right now, it's okay to feel that. And so, again, it's just that awareness aspect of it too. And that's why therapy is so great. Obviously, we're biased, but, you know, it does really help to have someone to speak to. Um, Okay, we're going to move on to anxiety. Karina, you did talk about that, and I know it's a big part of the work that you do with your clients. Um, how did anxiety show up for you? You mentioned a little bit, but how did anxiety show up for you during that time? Was it different from the loss of your brother versus the loss of your dad and stepdad?
Yeah, I would say after like my brother died, I definitely had a lot of things going on, but I wouldn't say I experienced a lot of like new anxiety around that, around his
Hmm.
death. The other things like what we've talked about. With my dad's death about 5 years later, that's when that like really strong anxiety started to come on. And it had to do with a lot of those assumptions I had talked about knowing the world around me. But also my emotional capacity was like, we talk about our window of tolerance, right? So like I my window of tolerance is already, pretty thin, pretty
Yeah,
small given everything that was going on. And then it like got smaller and I felt like I just had zero emotional capacity to put up with people's crap, to put up with, it's almost like when you see race cars and they're going at really, really high speeds, if they even hit like a pebble, like the car can like flip or
yeah,
like change course. And so that's kind of how I think of it was all of a sudden even just like little pebbles in your day, right, could cause a bunch of anxiety, could cause a bunch of like feeling super emotionally dysregulated. I was already extremely emotionally dysregulated as it was, but so I just felt like things were out of my control. I remember thinking about going to work at the time. I worked in the financial industry and things could be quite stressful. And I remember just thinking one day about having to go to work and being like, if someone is rude to me, and I don't mean like coworkers, right? I mean like unfortunately sometimes clients, I thought if someone's rude to me, if someone yells at me, if this like I'm gonna flip out. I'm gonna slam the door. I'm gonna throw something. I'm gonna leave. I had zero, I felt completely ungrounded and unanchored. And it felt like anything could happen at any time. And I had no idea how I was going to react. That's how stressed out and anxious and grief stricken I felt, where just everything felt out of control. Um, and I think at the time I called a counselor because I thought if I got to be able to go to work. And a big thing we worked on too was like some reframing. We actually, cognitive behavioral therapy did help. I know it gets a bad rap, but
Yeah.
it does, yeah. But reframing a lot of what was going on and anchoring into like, what is in your control? What can you do? How can you seek support? What does make you feel safe? What is in your control? Because I think a lot of the time with grief too, we have all these societal messages that we're just inundated with, and we don't really realize that we're struggling with internalized capitalism, right? Because it's such all these strong messages of like, you have to work and you have to do this and and it's like people will be like, oh, but you get a whole 3 days off or is the norm. And people are pushing themselves so hard to just be in the world. And it's hard to like change their thinking a little bit sometimes. It's like, okay, well, you're not the person you were before. It's going to be a while probably before you can perform in certain aspects the way you could before, right? But again, that's a lot of people self-identify as being a certain kind of person. I know I did, where it was like, I'm really good at this and I do all these things and I have to be a certain level of productive to be worthy, right? And so it challenges often like what we think of things, and some of it's relearning your capacity is different than it used to be.
Yeah.
And you're not, you don't have the same emotional energy maybe to put towards something. And sometimes it's also, sometimes we do have resources. Sometimes we can take some time off. Sometimes we do have wiggle room in our schedule or to change things up. Sometimes we actually do, but it's also looking at our belief system and the things we're inundated with, right? Because often there's those beliefs. I know I had a lot of them where it was like, but I have to do these things or else. It's like, well, do you? Like, you're operating a certain way doesn't mean you have to operate that way. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And just for anyone who's listening who doesn't know, I know we talked about window of tolerance. That's just what we're referencing to here is that's just our capacity to cope with what's going on. And that's going to change depending on what's happening in your life. So when we're in our window of tolerance and depending, like if you're going through a really tough time and there's a lot of grief and loss and trauma and just your day to day, just burnt out and all that, our window of tolerance is really small because we don't have the bandwidth or the capacity or the emotional capacity to deal with it. That's why I think it's really important. When I talk about this often too, is like slowing down and being really grounded, is that window of tolerance gets bigger. Now we have more capacity to deal with the hard things that are happening. And that is what we mean by window of tolerance. And again, it's going to change, right? From what's happening in your life, where you are, what your capacity is, how much it's impacting you. And so that's what that is. And then usually what we talk about is when you're in hyper arousal, that's your anxiety, your anger, your frustration. And then you can also be on the other end of that is the hypoarousal, which is when you're numb, you're dissociated, you pull back, like Corinna mentioned that earlier on, just with certain aspects of her grief and loss. And that's all normal. This is just, a really good way to just explain and just realize where we're at and when we're in fight or flight or when something's happening. But our goal is to come back to that window of tolerance and to allow that window of tolerance to get bigger. So we create more space in our life, in our mind, in our body to then do the emotional work, to do whatever's present and to work through that. So just thought I'd add that in case anyone who's listening doesn't know what that is. That's what we're referring to here.
Beautifully said. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
a great
Yeah.
explanation. Yeah.
I know you mentioned CBT. I'm laughing because it does get a bad rep, but 'cause talking about coping with your anxiety, because I'm sure a lot of people who are listening are going to relate to what you're sharing, Karina. And anxiety is just such a big one in general, whether it's grief and loss related or generally, right? Like I definitely am one who runs anxious for sure. What are some tools or practices that you personally lean on when anxiety shows up for you?
Like when anxiety with grief shows up.
Or just in
That's role.
general, like
Okay.
you can mention
Yeah.
if they're different, you can specify, but yeah, just what I guess in general, what are some tools or practices that help you?
Yeah, for sure. I think I'm just trying to think of it. So I find in grief and anxiety, right, it's sometimes we're also feeling anxious. I find most of the time because things feel out of our control. So
Mhm.
often I'll say to clients, or I'll have them do different practices, and we'll go into things like, and for myself too, right? Like, what is in your control? What does help you to feel safe? And often, it's coming up with a list of things like, what does help me to feel like a bit calmer? What
Mm,
is it, like drinking tea? Is it wearing my favorite sweatshirt? Is it having a plan where if I'm out somewhere and I start to feel overwhelmed, I can leave, right? I find, it's a little bit of like mapping your nervous system states, right? What brings you, like, what does, like you said, widen your window a little bit? Is it grounding yourself? Is it taking some deep breaths? Is it reminding yourself, right, of right? Is having a mantra to help you get through. What helps you to feel calm and safe? Are there safe, supportive people that you can call if you need to? So I find I usually work with people, and I've done this myself too. It's like, what helps me to feel safe? What does help me process some of my feelings? Because a lot of the time, I find myself included, if I have a lot of anxiety, I actually find a lot of the time I'm actually like avoiding certain things or pushing things down. And a
that's
lot of
very
the,
valid.
right. So a lot of the time it's like, do I need to talk to someone about how I'm feeling? Do I need to journal a little bit and get into like, maybe use the feeling wheel journal? Like there's a lot of feelings that I'm pushing down and I'm starting to feel anxious about it. So I think every person is a little bit different and what's going to help them or work for them are different. So these are just some things I sometimes do. I might suggest to clients, but I think it's starting to rebuild those like internal pieces of safety, and that happens on different levels, right? I think
Mhm.
sometimes having a mantra or things to remind you of feeling safe on like the mental level. It's usually having a coping skill on the physical level. Is it grounding yourself? Is it taking some deep breaths? Right? What is it? Is it a visual? What is it for you? And then to be able to process some of what's going on. Okay, I know I'm feeling anxious. What helps me? Is it going for a walk? Is it writing in my journal? Is it just feeling and acknowledging what's happening inside instead of pushing it down and ignoring it? Yeah. Anyway, so that was very long-winded, but
No, I love that.
yeah.
So much, so many tools in there and just what you can do and different aspects of that. Would you say, do you have a favorite mantra or anything that really helps you that you'd love to share? If not, you don't have to, but I'm a big
Yeah.
affirmations and mantra. So when I'm in it, I do repeat them. I even write sticky
Mm,
notes. Sometimes I put them on my fridge or in my bathroom in the mirror.
yeah.
I have a little whiteboard type of thing on my in my kitchen and I'll
Wow.
write quotes on there. And it's not toxic positivity. It just really helps me. Like, example, I even wake up, I'm like, today's a good day to have a good day. I use that often because it changes my energy because I do wake up a lot of times with anxiety, right? I think a lot of us do, or
Yeah.
when we're going to sleep, we wake up and we go to sleep with that weight of all of our issues weighing on us. And then so if we can just change the energy, and I know those get a bad rep too, because it's not just like you're saying it, it's not fluff, right? You actually have to do the deeper work, of
Yeah.
course. It's not like you can just go around and saying, you know, whatever it is, you have to actually really feel it. And then the deeper work is where the work actually happens. But to
Yeah.
have those reminders, anyway, so that's what I do. But I'm curious, so if you have any of your favorite ones or anything that works for
Ooh.
you.
I think for me, it like depends on what season I'm going through. That might sound interesting. Like different ones come up depending on what I'm going through. I find because I do somatic therapy as well, I actually
Mhm.
find for me lately, and if you're not familiar with somatic therapy, it's a body-based therapy where you build resources and often you build, so part of resourcing is maybe creating like a protector or like a parental figure, or like it's a bit of it has to do with say reparenting. I actually find lately a big reminder, especially because my dad and my stepdad have passed away, something that's really helpful for me is like imaginal. I actually often imagine like God or a father figure like holding my hand because I don't have a father anymore.
Mhm.
And although that probably sounds weird, I find like just imagining having somebody with me when I'm going through really difficult things is
Mhm.
really helpful. Like this imaginal sense that there's someone there with me helping me. And so I would say in a lot of my mantras, it's really like with grief, there can be so much loneliness. So I know a lot of the mantras I've had, I'm not alone. I really believe that my lost loved ones are with me, is what I would say.
Mhm.
Anyway, again, it's kind of roundabout, sorry, but
No, I love that.
yeah.
Thank you for sharing. I like the imagination part of that too, as I do that sometimes as well. It's like, because again, you're right, it's very isolating. It can be very isolating. And so knowing that you are not alone and that there's people there, and like we talked about, our loved ones are still around in whichever way that is. And so, okay, we touched on the movies, and you shared obviously something so important as when you were going through your grief, it was not what it was like in the movies. And so, what did you think grief would look like? And then what did it actually look and feel like when you were going through it? If
That's
there's anything you haven't shared around that.
yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I think in the movies, a lot of the time when someone passes away, you're in the hospital, you're holding their hand, and everyone's wearing makeup, and the hospital's clean, and like they just leave and they walk in the snow or something, or there's a moment and the movie ends and it's kind of like, oh, they had this moment, and there's just this kind of feeling of like, oh, that's it, it's done, like everything's over. Whereas I just find in real life, that's just the beginning, right? Because a lot of the time we actually take a lot of our belief systems, even though we don't realize it, from like pop culture and movies,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
right? And I think a lot of the time people like, I thought that too. When my brother died, I thought, well, he's not suffering. I'm feeling a bit of relief. I think I'm just going to move on. I feel like I've dealt with this enough, movie end, chop. But it's like, well, that's not realistic, right? And I mean, a lot comes after that. There's literally the rest of your life. There's everything else. There's all those secondary losses that come up. There's like the ugly stuff. You know, you don't see a lot of that in pop culture movies. There's the ugly parts of it. There's dealing with their estate, there's dealing with their funeral and their body and their final wishes, and there's like ugly crying in the bathroom at work because you're overwhelmed and feeling like you're going to have a nervous breakdown. There's all those things that come afterward that a lot of the time our culture doesn't really like to acknowledge.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that was a it's a good topic and conversation to have because and you hit on something that was so I thought that was really good. Is that our beliefs do come from society, pop culture, and all of that. And a lot of times they're not even our own, but that's just what we're conditioned. That's all we know. That's what we're conditioned to believe, or that's what we listen to and watch. And so that can really shift the dynamic of our process in itself. And so if anyone's listening, the movies doesn't show it all. And yeah, again, most movies it is peaceful, like you said, right? Just kind of they pass away and then that's it. It kind of move on. But there's so much more, like Karina hit on so many different aspects of what that looks like. Okay, we're gonna starting to close off. I'd like to go into the rebuilding, the transformation piece of
So
that.
once
I know we've talked about this, Karina, you and I have, but I also talk about it on the podcast as I'm a big believer, firm believer in post-traumatic growth. And so my question really is transitioning from everything that you shared and where you are now, how has your grief changed over time?
that's such a good question. How has my grief changed over time? It's less intense, it's less raw.
Mhm.
I would say I have more outlets for it, and I purposefully take time to feel my grief, like on purpose. It's not like when my dad died, it was just spilling all over the place. It was just everywhere all the time. And there was beauty in that too. That was a learning process. But now I would say I feel like I have a bit more choice, right? I'm a little more intentional. There's not so much intensity. And I can, like I was putting up my Christmas tree yesterday and it's like, okay, how am I gonna honor my loved ones this Christmas? How am I going to include them? Taking intentional time to do things and to feel things. Um, yeah, I would say for me, it's like that's the big things. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Because at the beginning, everything's so intense, it's so consuming, and yeah, like you said, it just impacts so many areas. And so I love that. And I would say that's a testament to the emotional processing, the therapy, the coping mechanisms that you built, the resources and tools that you have now in your toolkit to help support you during that time. You did touch on something, which was the Christmas, and I saw that. I saw you share about that, and I thought that was really beautiful with the ornaments. And so my next question was like, I think we both talked about believing in some sort of like afterlife or just feeling that our loved ones are still around. And we learn to find, and grief and loss, when you lose someone like that, we learn to find ways to stay close to them in some which way. It's gonna be different for everyone. But how would you say you stay connected to your brother, your dad, your stepdad now? Are there ways you continue to honor them in your life?
Yeah, there are. Um, I think, oh, those probably sounds funny because this isn't intentional, but I dream about them a lot. So
I love.
I know they're like on my mind a lot. And I think initially after like especially my brother passed, I had a lot of dreams. I was quite distressed looking for him. But now I have a lot of dreams where he's like helping me do things. So I find it's really sweet. Yeah, I'll be like doing a repair in the house and he's like, they're helping me. Um, and so I find I embrace more things, right? And noticing those changes. So I journal about it and I just think about it and I'm grateful for things like that. Um, and sometimes I'll do different things. Like before my dad passed away, he came to visit me where I live now, and we went for a walk together. So sometimes I'll just like, even though we didn't live in the same town for most of my life, I will sometimes take the walk that we walked that time he visited me in my new place and just be really mindful and think about him and think about our conversation. I'll eat the food they liked. Like me and my stepdad, he loved red. He loved all different, like he liked a lot of the same kind of foods as me. So I'll buy his favorite chocolate, for Christmas and I'll eat it and I'll think about him and or like watching really silly Christmas movies that like I would watch with my brother and my dad and things like that. So I just kind of try to bring them into the room, right? Like think about them and let let those memories come even if sometimes it is like still painful at times, right? But and talking about them to people, talking about them at Christmas with my family. Sometimes we'll even, if it's one of their birthdays, sometimes we'll buy them a cake. I
Yeah.
think it's just not ignoring it. I think the important thing for me is like acknowledging things. I tried to push things down and ignore them, and that didn't work. And so I think it's just the acknowledgement for me is the important part.
I
Yeah.
think it's so important. I love all of what you shared. I agree with that. I incorporate similar things as well in my own life with the grief. And I do love celebrating their birthday still. I love getting a cake still as if they were still here physically with us. And Christmas time, going back to that, is getting special ornaments. I'm a really big sucker for sentimental things like that. I know you shared that also. I think that's also important, right? And you find your own way, whatever feels right for you. And I think these are just great ideas. I think sometimes it's nice because we can get sometimes stuck on what that can look like. I know I appreciated that when I hear other people share how they carry their loved one's memory alive and how they honor them. And so thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. Okay, we're going to talk about post-traumatic growth.
Okay.
And I'm just curious, how do you relate to the concept of post-traumatic growth? And then in what ways has your grief shaped the person you are today?
It's I yeah, I find like my relationship with post-traumatic growth, like the word and the concept, I find it's difficult sometimes. The like, post-traumatic growth is, you've been through something and you've done a lot of work and you're able to essentially not overcome it, but basically be resilient and work through it and come out the other side. And sometimes even, doing better than you did before. right?
Mhm.
And that's a concept I love, but I've also find some at times I've really hated because I felt pressure. And I know I've heard that from people too. And that's common in grief culture right now, where it's like, we shouldn't have to. And, like it puts this pressure, I guess. How would I say it relates to myself though? I think for me, like after my brother died, and that's kind of where I talk about that post-traumatic growth idea being like difficult for me.
Right.
Whereas I think I didn't really have a choice, is how I felt when my dad died. It's like, okay, I have to work on this. And how does that relate to me? I think it really is part of grief, like waking you up. Like, that's for me. It doesn't have to be for other people. But for me, I felt like grief woke me up to the idea that there was more, that I was on limited time, right? We're not all here forever. And that, if you're not living the life you want to live, that's kind of up to you. And
Mhm.
of course, there are circumstances, but
Of course.
we're responsible for ourselves. And I just started to realize, oh, I'm not really living the life I want to live. And I
Mhm.
have a lot of wonderful things and I'm quite happy, but I think I just started to question and search for like what would make me happier? What would bring more joy into my life? What would, I don't know, what would change things for me? Am I really living? I think I was operating out of fear for a long time. I had felt like I had had a lot of uncertainty in my life, and so I clung to things that felt certain. And then when my dad died, I just felt like, oh, maybe everything is kind of uncertain. And once I accepted that, yeah, things are uncertain, which I still struggle with though. Like I have to accept that all the time. But I think it was like, okay, well, if a lot of things are uncertain, like even these things you're clinging to, they're not certain either. So if you're not happy, like with certain aspects of your life, then it's up to you to change them. And
Absolutely.
so I think it pushed me, one, to like deal with a lot of my pain. And it pushed me to go, well, like, what else is out there? What else do you want in your life? And how are you going to work on getting those things? And so I guess for me, I don't know if that's a great explanation, but I guess for me, it just pushed me, one, because I realized I had a lot more capacity and strength and flexibility than I really realized.
Yeah.
I had to maybe like stretch or like break a little bit to realize that in life. But yeah, I really do believe that, of course, within reason, that we can really do amazing things. We can shift and change and we can transform if that's what we want, right?
Yeah.
It's up to you. You don't have to change anything because of grief. You don't, right? I don't believe in putting any kind of pressure on people or anything like that. It's okay if you just get through it. And it's also
Mhm.
okay if it shifts your perception and your reality and it shifts a lot of the things that you want, or it brings those things to the surface and you can't ignore them anymore. And it's okay to like embrace a full life and go after the things that you want that maybe weren't for different reasons, right? Sometimes I think due to old belief systems that sometimes we call into question when people die, or maybe you're a caregiver for someone and you've devoted your life to them, right? There's lots of different reasons. But yeah, I guess I would just say it opened me up to a lot of pain, and at the same time it opened me up to a lot of possibility. Like I really believe in um, duality, and that we have capacity for great pain and for great beauty and great strength and great resilience, and that we can hold both at the same time and we can have the things that we want in life. We can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. So much there. But I think, yeah, we do have the capacity. And I think what it comes down to is, if we want something, change starts and ends with us, right? Like we have the ability to do that, and nothing's going to change until we change. And so,
Yes.
depending on where you're at and what you're looking for in your life, like it's up to us to do that. And that is part of the post-traumatic growth, is creating that new opportunities, just new capacity, and just things that we work towards. And it doesn't mean that things are not going to be hard again. And just speaking to what you said with your duality, both can be held at the same time. Okay, we're going to wrap up with one final question, then we'll do the rapid fire. For someone who's in deep grief right now, what would you want them to hear about moving forward and finding joy again in their life?
Well, I think one of the things I've said a few times today is one, that intensity, the initial intensity is going to dial down. I think we forget that sometimes. It feels so intense that I know sometimes that fear of, is this ever gonna am I ever gonna feel functional and am I gonna be okay? So I think the first thing I would say is it's gonna take time, but this intensity is going to go down. It's not going to be as hard to deal with. And yeah, you will find joy again, right? We talked about duality, and I think sometimes it's allowing ourselves to embrace those moments and see the beauty in life and, right, to hold both, to show up for yourself, to take care of yourself. And I think sometimes what happens too is we have often guilt. We think like my grief is my connection to my person. And if I let go of some of this grief, I'm going to let go of them. And what I would say is, your grief is not your connection to them, your love is, your memories, right? All of the things you did together, the relationship that you still have with them. And so I think sometimes when we start to let go a little bit of the guilt that we start to experience when joyful moments come up is like the start of feeling joy again, right? They would want you to experience joy. And I know that can be cliche too, but it's okay to let go of some of that guilt and to know that the grief is not your connection, right? The love is your connection. And I find with grievers too, I would say like it's okay to embrace dark humor, like weird humor.
Okay.
That's like a big one. Sometimes, like I find with other grievers, like the jokes that come up that we'll laugh at, other people would probably be like, "Oh, right." But it's like you have to kind of embrace like life is weird and weird, strange, painful things happen. And also sometimes it's funny. Sometimes like there's a lot of weird things that you're gonna find funny and don't be hard on yourself about it. If you have a good moment, just let it be there, even if it feels really weird and really dark.
Totally. Oh my gosh, I loved everything you shared. Yeah, humor, I think it sometimes can be an antidote to grief. Honestly, you feel lighter, there's humor there, and life is just so serious as it is. So why not just make light of it? And yeah, I loved what you said about also the grief isn't your connection, the love is the connection. That was very pivotal. I really enjoyed hearing that, which I think is like so real because that aspect of it, and I work with clients who also feel by moving forward or by getting back into, quote unquote normal life and back to their routine and back into being a member of society is like that means that they're leaving their loved one behind. It's a real thing in grief. And so what you said there is really helpful. It's like the connection to them isn't the grief, it's the love. And that's where then coming to find ways to honor their love and to honor their memory. And that's what we talked about with that, and finding ways to still celebrate them and talk about them, say their name out loud, like speak to them with your friends and your family. That's that connection and love piece there.
Beautifully
Yeah.
said. Yeah, I
Cool.
love that.
Great. Thank you for that. We're just going to close off with the rapid fire. So I'm just going to give you, it's basically like a this or that.
Okay.
Um, so text or phone call,
Text,
planner or go with the flow.
planner,
Yeah, me too. Hit the town or cozy night in?
cozy night in,
Forest or ocean?
ocean,
Thinker or feeler?
both.
Yeah. Get lost in a book or binge a TV series?
Ooh, right now, TV series. Yeah,
Rewrite the past or see the future?
see the future.
Yeah, I feel like that's a common one. Well, thank you so much, Karina, for coming on here and sharing your story so openly and vulnerably. There was so much there. I can't wait to go back and listen to it and then upload it. I think there's so much that people can take from what you shared with both your personal experience and lived experience, but also your professional experience as well. And so, yeah, thank you so much. And that's going to be a wrap for this episode for everyone tuning in to the Story Hour podcast. And we will see everyone soon. Okay, bye.